Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The issue tonight is intergenerational equity or inequity. And my guest is Paul Kershaw. He is a professor at University of BC, and he's the founder of an organization and a website called Generation Squeeze. I came across him because he wrote a couple of articles in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago. That was really quite interesting because he was really suggesting that our federal budget and a lot of the different things that are going on economically in our society today are really unfair to young people and are really advantaging people that look like me, if not older than me, and that this is not right. And so I really wanted to check in with him and see what his argument's all about. I'll describe Professor Kershaw and his background, which is really quite impressive, in more detail in a couple of minutes. But Paul Kershaw, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. So tell me, what is Generation Squeeze? And maybe you can give us sort of the overview, 60,000 feet of your argument.
Yeah, so Generation Squeeze is what we like to call a think and change tank. So we're not just putting out good policy ideas. We actually want to see those ideas implemented in the world of politics. We're a think and change tank, one in Canada to work for all generations, promote well-being for all generations. And the unique way that we contribute to that is by championing this idea of generational fairness. We want to preserve what Canadians hold to be sacred, like a healthy home and a healthy childhood and a healthy planet, so that we all leave a legacy of which we are proud. And I guess from 60,000 feet, the argument would be we are at real risk of not leaving that legacy of which our aging population would want to be proud. We are, I would say, we have this underlying disease of generational unfairness that is giving rise to a range of symptoms that I think your readers and listeners will be familiar with. Housing unaffordability, climate change, and underinvestment in the generation raising young kids, and a routinization of running government deficits, even when we're not in recession. I can tell you, as we talk throughout our time together today, each of those is a symptom of a dysfunctional generational system.
So I heard this quote at one point in time that we're the first generation in history to spend more on people over the age of 65 than people under the age of 18. Is that, do you think, correct?
That's interesting. I would suspect that, I don't know if we're the first, but we certainly have that trend. I think one of the factoids that would be worthwhile for your listeners right now is think about the federal budget that came out just a couple of weeks ago, and which I was writing about, as you said. And over the next 5 years, the federal government projects $132 billion in deficit spending, even though we're not going to be in a recession for a year, according to its own data. You're like, well, why are we running these large deficits? And is it because we're investing a ton to address housing unaffordability? Not really. Is it because we're really tackling climate change aggressively? The answer is 84% of the deficit spending is going to rising spending on old age security for our aging population. This includes my mom and many other moms being out there right now, so it's important, plus the medical care that our aging population is needing. And so the growing spending at a provincial and federal level is disproportionately going to an aging population, really important people. But by contrast, those really important people who are older want to leave a legacy that's proud for their kids and grandchildren. And we are not having enough of a conversation publicly amongst our politicians to even recognize that we're at risk of failing on that front.
So are you suggesting we need to go into even greater deficits to spend more money on young people, or do we need to cut the spending on older people?
Oh, what interesting way of framing it. I do think we need to invest more urgently in a younger demographic. I think the question is, are we getting the best bang for our dollars investing later on in life? And importantly, are we raising enough revenue to cover that piece so that we don't run out of money for things that matter for younger folks? So it's not, I would caution us about thinking we're going to do a lot of dramatic cuts for an aging population. That doesn't make sense to me. I do think we could ask more affluent baby boomers, though, what might they be able to contribute to make sure that the needs of their generation are taken care of by that generation without leaving too many unpaid bills for those who follow in their footsteps.
So Macron in France is trying to increase the age of retirement to, I guess, sort of address some of this issue. Do you think that's a smart policy?
So just to remind your listeners that in France, the big debate with many a protest is about moving the average age of retirement from 62 to 64. People will know that in Canada, we're at 65. There was a time when Prime Minister Harper proposed raising it to 67. Indeed, that was going to be the law. And then Prime Minister Trudeau came to power and rolled that back. Here's what I would say. None of those changes are actually going to impact today's aging population. they've reached that retirement, or any phasing in of adaptations to their age of retirement aren't going to impact them. Given that we're seeing the harm of a dysfunctional generational system in the way that it's benefiting today's older population, but not their kids and grandchildren, I think their kids and grandchildren have to say, we don't want to do that to those who are following in our footsteps. So I would propose that we need to talk more about how we should adjust upward towards maybe 67 or so, the average age of retirement, for which Gen Xers and those who, and millennials and Gen Z, they're going to have to live with that new reality. But if we're going to work longer lives, can we have better work-life balance each year before that? Could we have shorter working years over longer working lives? So combine the debates about 4-day work weeks with a rising retirement age. I think that's going to be a novel, important conversation going forward. I think we're going to be hard to resist that over time. And just as a reminder, when we started our old age security system in I think it was 1966, if I recall, at that time, you qualified for old age security when you turned 70. And average life expectancy was 72. Now, if you flash forward to today, people are qualifying at age 65, average life expectancy 7 to 10 years longer. And so there are real pressures on a public finance if we don't start thinking about either collecting more revenue to pay for more generous pension benefits and or thinking about the age of qualifying for them.
Well, I understand this, the way that the incentive system that the government has, such that you delay your retirement benefits to the age 70 work, that you actually have to live longer than the average life expectancy for it to pay off. So effectively, the government is asking you to bet against yourself if you're gonna, or the government's betting against you in that incentive scheme, which is kind of ironic that the government wants you to delay taking your pension so that you save the government treasury money on average.
Well, that's a detail of the public policy and pension planning that I am less familiar with. So I'm going to nod in response to what you're saying and say, I'll have to look into that one more.
Well, it's a bothersome thing for me because I'm getting near to that decision point. We're going to chat a little bit longer with Paul Kershaw, University of BC professor and foundation of Generation Squeeze, in just 2 minutes after we take a quick message break about this issue of intergenerational equity, or what I think is, frankly, inequity in a lot of it. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Paul Kershaw, Dr. Paul Kershaw. He's an award-winning tenured professor at the University of British Columbia. He's a public speaker, a regular media contributor, and a foundation of Generation Squeeze, a think and change tank that promotes well-being for all generations by turning evidence into action and rejuvenating democracy to protect what is sacred for the younger and future generations, a healthy childhood, home, and planet. He received the award for Academic of the Year in 2016 from the Confederation of University Faculty Associations of British Columbia for his scholarly work on generational fairness. Twice, the Canadian Political Science Association has honored Kershaw with the national prizes for his gender and politics research. He and his Gen Squeeze colleagues received the award for BC's Affordable Housing Champion in 2017 from the Provincial Housing Central Coalition, while the Government of Canada awarded him with its inaugural prize for excellence in moving knowledge to action on housing in 2018. Pretty impressive background, sir.
Thank you very much. I know my mom takes pride in that bio.
That's great.
You can edit that out, though, later on. Okay.
Well, I've actually got more that I want to talk about because you're a policy professor in the UBC School of Population and Public Health and a director of the UBC Masters of Public Health program. What was your PhD in?
It was an interdisciplinary degree in political science, law, and economics.
Well, and what was the argument?
Focusing on the importance of work-life balance for a range of public policy goods, gender equality, child development. So Gen Squeeze, as an organization, got started championing the idea of a new deal for families, the idea of like $10 a day childcare, better parental leave, better work-life balance. And as we were doing that, we talked about the need for more affordable childcare and better income when raising young kids, because housing was getting so much more and more and more expensive and leaving earnings behind. And before too long, people said, why don't you talk more about housing policy solutions as well? And so the organization grew into that space. And throughout all of it, the argument has been, we are more likely as a society in Canada to invest generously later in our life course. That's a really important thing to do for my mom and my aging family members and aging family members who you love. but we've been weaker at it doing it earlier in the life course. And we've been too ready as a society right now to kind of extract a lot for the benefit of this moment and leaving less left over. So let me give you 3 examples. Example number 1, think about our housing system right now, especially in BC and Ontario. Your audience is in Toronto. So Toronto and Vancouver are the epicenter of this. We've extracted so much housing wealth from our housing system in the last decades that we now leave little affordability left over. What I mean about extracting housing wealth? Well, as home prices rise, somebody like me who's been a homeowner for 18 years, I get wealthier. In fact, in the last 4 years, I've gained $1 million in my home while I've been sleeping. But that means someone just as smart as me and just as hardworking as me now can't live where I do, all because of what's benefited me, and we're now locking her out of the housing market. The same analysis is evident in terms of climate change. We extract so much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon. We leave extreme weather as our legacy. Or with regards to tax dollars, we extract so much of the available tax dollars from economic growth, allocate it towards the aging of the population, and then we leave less left over for their kids and grandchildren and run large deficits even when we're not in recession. So there's an extraction moment right now that is not consistent with our being good ancestors, to borrow another colleague's phrase. And Jen Squeeze is really asking us to let's plan for all ages. Let's be good stewards, and let's follow the intergenerational golden rule. Do unto other generations as you'd want them to do unto you. And I think right now Canada could really shift asking ourselves, are we living by those intergenerational principles?
How have we gotten to here? Are we just selfish, or do we realize that we're selfish, or are governments just catering to our desire for value and benefits now and not telling us the reality of what we're doing to the future? Like, how did we get here?
I think there's a few ways that we got here, but one of them is that we haven't been as honest with a baby boom demographic as we ought to have been with regards to the amount of taxes they've paid over their lives. And I know you're going to get some angry emails and voicemails and responses as I talk about this, but here's the demographic reality. When baby boomers came of age, there were about 7 working age adults in Canada for every retiree. We called them a baby boom and a baby bulge for a reason, because we knew later on there was going to be far fewer workers. So today now there are only 3 workers for every retiree. That has huge implications for public finance, which we didn't actually really plan all that well for in Canada. So in 1960s, 1970s, baby boomers come of age and they're like, oh, we can pay for medical care and for retirement income security for the seniors today because there's not that many of them. But we'll pay at a level that will cover, 7 of us contributing for 1 retiree. And over time, we're like, just normalize that was the amount that we needed to pay, without recognizing there was going to be a time when boomers had reached retirement and they now wanted to consume the same amount of retirement income support and medical care, but they didn't prepay for what they would want to use. They paid enough for a small group of retirees, not enough for their large group of retirees. And that is the conversation we haven't had enough with boomers. And we had one moment where we tried to get really serious about this. In the mid-1990s, around 1996, 97, we started to recognize that the baby boomer bulge was going to have harmful implications for the Canada Pension Plan. And so in 1997, we said, oh, you know what? We're going to have to increase quite dramatically by about 60% the premiums that people were contributing to CPP so that there'd be enough there to draw down commensurate with what they contributed. But we didn't do that for our old age security system, and we didn't do that for medical care, both very age-oriented policies, and we're really reaping the pressures of that right now. So that we got here because we didn't have a hard conversation about what does a changing demographic going from 7 workers for every retiree to 3 workers for every retiree mean for public finance. And now we need to catch up.
So is that one of the reasons why we're dramatically increasing our levels of immigration? And is that a solution to the problem?
Brilliant question. That's precisely one of the dominant reasons why we are increasing our immigration numbers. And you can understand why. We could either ask in today's aging population, especially the more affluent among them, oh, darn, during your working years, we didn't collect enough from you. And so now we need to catch up by asking you to contribute more now. That's a hard conversation electorally. So instead, we're going to just try and actually bring in more taxpayers. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to shore up the number of workers relative to retirees by bringing in more immigrants. Now, that strategy might have worked brilliantly if our invitation to immigrants today was what it was a couple of decades ago. And what I mean by that is, you could come in the 70s and 80s as an immigrant, land full-time work, and to some degree struggle, but be able to manage your cost of living, your major cost of living, housing. But now housing is so much more expensive that it's creaming young people who've already were born here and have good educations, let alone other newcomers of the day. And so we are combining this pressure of let's bring in more immigrants so we have more taxpayers into a housing system that is not at all inviting for a newcomer or a young person. And ironically, amplifying demand for housing in our cities, which will drive up the wealth of existing homeowners, myself included, and drive on affordability for young people and those newcomers. And so that's this tension where the desire for more immigrants is a solution to the tax challenge we have with baby boomers is ironically going to drive their housing wealth, but augment unaffordability for newcomers and young people.
So you talked about the lack of revenue and that taxes should go up. We did have a GST or an HST that was 2 points higher at one point in time, and Prime Minister Stephen Harper reduced it by 2 points. Was that a mistake?
Likely. There are going to be other colleagues out there who will talk more about the value of a sales taxation as a way to raise revenue. I mean, each point of GST is probably worth $6-7 billion, maybe even more than that these days. When last I looked, so we're giving up 12 to 14 billion a year with those 2 points, and we're running large deficits at the federal level, and those 2 points could make a difference. But I would say the bigger issue for us to look at is this potential win-win. It's controversial. But take my story. So I'm in Metro Vancouver. As I mentioned, my home has gone up $1 million over the last several years while I've been sleeping. And because it's my principal residence, it's entirely sheltered from taxation. And that's, I think, a really interesting observation for us to recognize. The biggest public investment into housing is delivered through the tax shelter for homeowners in their principal residences. It costs the federal government alone about $10 billion a year, and spread across the provinces, it probably matches that again. And so is there a way that we could say, that shelter for housing wealth in principal residences is an opportunity for us to think about, is it the best use of public expenditures? Why are we sheltering housing wealth when we don't shelter other kinds of assets in the same way? And I think in particular, we could ask older homeowners who live in homes that are worth more than $1 million to say, might we at this moment need to lean in more to contribute, to try and slow down home prices from rising any further, make sure that, we as more affluent and well-housed, securely housed people in our cities are contributing to public programs like medical care that we're going to want to count on, and have some revenue perhaps available to invest in deeply affordable housing for those who follow in our footsteps without leaving them large deficits. So I would say, succinctly, Paul, do it succinctly. We've been printing housing wealth in cities like Toronto and Vancouver and elsewhere. And yet we do not tap into that housing wealth that we've been printing of late. And I think it's an untapped resource for us to figure out how best to deal with some of the challenges intergenerationally that we're facing.
So in the United States, if you sell a house, you don't have a principal residence exemption. But you do, if you take your proceeds and put it into a house of the same or greater value, you don't have to pay tax. So you effectively get that principal residence exemption as long as you're taking the proceeds and putting it into another house of equal or greater value. So therefore, you really only pay the tax when you downsize or when you die. And so you pay the tax eventually, but maybe only once. Or when you move out of that bigger house. So is that a better system?
Yeah, so we created the homeownership tax shelter in Canada, where we exempted capital gains from principal residences from taxation about 50 years ago. Yeah, and I wish we hadn't done it then. It was a mistake then. 50 years later, it's hard to correct that mistake by suddenly saying we're going to implement American-style capital gains taxation on housing going forward. It sounds simple in theory. It's more challenging in practice. I won't bore your listeners with too many of those details. What I would say instead is this. Everyone in Toronto has already normalized with the idea that on an annual basis, they're going to pay some property taxes to their municipality or the city of Toronto. I think it's time for us to say, and for those in homes that are more valuable, say $1 million, or we can all quibble about what the right threshold is. Can we add a little bit of a surtax? Some progressivity to our property taxation. We're used to having progressivity in our income taxation. And in fact, what we now really need to think about is adding some progressivity to our property taxation. I think that would be a really good win-win-win for a range of reasons. It would signal we don't want home prices to be crossing over these $1 million threshold. That's not a good thing. Those who are affluent enough and lucky enough like me to be in those homes, perhaps we can contribute more and do so in a way that actually showcases that housing has really changed class dynamics in Canada, especially in a place like Toronto. We did some polling at Gen Squeeze recently where we said, who's affluent and who's not? And we started with, consider a widow with an income of $25,000. That widow at $25,000 has a very low income, just barely above the poverty line. And the person says, oh, that person's poor. But she lives in a home that she owns outright that's now worth $1 million. And people are like, I'm not so sure. $2 million. Like, oh, that person's affluent. Then we flipped it on its head and we said, imagine a young person who's making $200,000 a year. And they're like, oh, clearly that person's affluent. It would put them in the top 1-2% of earners in the country. Top few percent, I should say. And then we said, but actually all they can afford to do is rent a 2-bedroom place. And they're like, oh.
Of less than 500 square feet.
Exactly. And they're like, oh. And then suddenly people are like, the person making $200,000, this is a young lawyer, is actually less affluent than the widow with a low income pension, but who is securely housed in this multi-million asset. That shows that, many people could have a home today in Toronto worth multiple millions of dollars that they purchased as a regular person, as a bus driver, as a nurse, as a waitress back in the 70s and 80s. And it now puts them in the global 1%. Their kids and grandchildren are locked out, even if they're higher earners. That's the class transformation that we really need to be paying more attention to, because there's an intergenerational tension at its heart.
Well, I think that housing affordability is the biggest issue that we've got right now in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, at least, probably if not across Canada, major metropolitan areas like Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary as well. And I want to come to that in greater detail in a couple of minutes after our next break. But on property taxes, how do you possibly think that people are going to agree to increases in property tax? A recent analysis in the Globe and Mail in Toronto showed that Toronto pays half of the property taxes of Hamilton, and that's like half of what the average would be in the United States. Vancouver actually had really low property taxes,
very low
as well. And what it is that politicians in Toronto, maybe Vancouver as well, I don't know, haven't had adult conversations, haven't been willing to have adult conversations with their electorate to say that they are paying unbelievably low property taxes. And in Toronto, what has happened is the gap has been filled by, number one, high taxes on commercial, which when you had this burgeoning office economy in downtown, you could do, maybe not sustainable today. Number two, massive development fees, which were really a tax on young people, renters, and newcomers. And the number three, going hat in hand to the provincial government and the federal government begging for money. It's, I don't think, going to come through property taxes, because municipal politicians have proven that they don't have the guts to politically try to get property taxes increased.
Well, I would take the blame off municipal municipal politicians alone. I would say generally our political culture has evolved in Canada of late to say, politicians, the way you're going to win my vote is to offer me more stuff without having, as you described it, the adult conversation about how we're going to pay for that. And we as citizens need to take some responsibility for that. We need to create political cover for our politicians to be more courageous in having the hard truth conversation about some of the fiscal challenges facing us. And when we come back from the break, I think we should really talk about, I think we're fighting right now over the moment of is this a moment of terrible, terrible scarcity? Or is there actually a little more affluence available than we sometimes acknowledge? The inflation conversation is just normalized everyone to say it's harder for everyone. But housing inflation has made everyday homeowners in Toronto fabulously richer. And I think we need to talk about that a wee bit more.
I agree. We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with Paul Kershaw and talk about housing affordability. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about intergenerational inequity with Dr. Paul Kershaw. He is the founder and lead researcher and executive chair and an award-winning tenured professor at the University of BC of a company, of an entity, of a think tank called Founder of Generation Squeeze, a think and change tank that promotes well-being for all generations by turning evidence into action and rejuvenating democracy to protect what is sacred for younger and future generations: a healthy childhood, home, and planet. Paul, let's talk about housing affordability. I'm of the opinion that that our low interest rates, number one, to a small degree, and then to a far larger degree, our NIMBYism and overregulation by municipal governments have led to a undersupply of housing that has led to something like, in the last two decades, a 40% appreciation on average of housing when CPI was much less than that. And I think that's led to this huge net wealth by homeowners and made it almost impossible for young people to buy homes. What's your analysis?
I'll just pause. You can repeat that again. That was pretty darn good. No, I think you're really, really bang on. That's a lovely summary. Here's some numbers that might intrigue your listeners. The value of principal residences today is $3.2 trillion higher than it was in 1977 when baby boomers were coming of age. $3.2 trillion more valuable. 2/3 of that is now owned. That extra housing wealth is owned by those over 55. So that's a lot of wealth accumulation. The flip side of that is, as home prices have left earnings behind, the kids and grandchildren have been really harmed. Their hard work doesn't pay off like it used to. How do I know that? Well, in 1976, 77, it would have taken the typical young Canadian, whether they were, regardless of where they were living, including in Metro Vancouver and the GTA, about 5 to 6 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average priced home. 5 to 6 years. If you flash forward to today, the Canadian average is 17 years. It's about 22 in Ontario and BC, 27 in the GTA and Metro Vancouver. That is a deterioration in the way that hard work pays off in terms of covering your major cost of living. And there are a range of reasons for it. Your focus on low interest rates, I think, is really important and critical right now. Indeed, a kind of NIMBYism that's got in the way of adding supply, adding density in land already zoned for residents is critical. Lack of public investment is another issue. But probably the biggest thing is, for so many years, those of us who have been homeowners have said, it's not so bad that home prices are rising. I'm getting some equity here. I have more security. It gives me options. I know of what I speak. I board against my home. I've invested in the stock market. I've invested in solar panels. I helped me buy a new car. I've made improvements in my home. It's made me wealthier. And I think it's because our initial, say, national housing strategy came out in 2017. Never once did it mention the word wealth. And if you're going to have a conversation about housing and housing prices rising without talking about wealth, we're just like blinding ourselves to, sure, it creates hardship for some, these rising home prices, but it's been benefiting others. And Gen Squeeze, I think, has done good work at getting people to recognize the hardship for young people and newcomers. We've been slower and less successful to poke and prod a little to those of us who are benefiting to say, we need to own up to some of the benefits now and talk about what we might owe as neighbors and citizens to get off the sidelines and start contributing more actively to policy solutions.
So your argument is that older people that have built up this net worth have an obligation to make use of it to benefit society.
Yeah, many a person will say, well, at the very least, I'm willing to try and help my own kids out. That's sort of the bank of mom and dad, whether you kind of free up some of your own equity to help your kids when they're needing it when they first start, or you're like, I'll pass it on in my estate. That is a within family, nice intergenerational sentiment. But I guess with my words today, I'm encouraging those listeners to think about, what do we out at the broader generational level? What about those who don't have young people who don't have a connection to an older family member with housing wealth? What are we going to do for them? What about these newcomers we're bringing in to, in part, relieve the pressure on asking an older demographic of boomers, especially affluent ones, to contribute more to their medical care and retirement income? And yet we're inviting these newcomers into a terrible housing market that's going to make it very hard for their hard work to pay off in terms of covering their cost of living. Yes, I do think we are at this moment where whether it's Toronto or Vancouver, and we're struggling with so many, people living on the street and unaffordability for young people, that we need to ask those who've been benefiting to potentially lean in. Paying slightly more in taxes would be part of it, being open to adding density into their existing neighborhoods, and saying that on our watch, we let the housing system degrade so much that unaffordability is our legacy. And that's not the legacy I really want to be remembered for.
Paul, one of the things that's really bothersome to me in this current Toronto mayoralty election, I'm not sure if you followed it at all in Vancouver, but it's interesting because it's the progressive politicians on the left that are, I would have thought, more concerned with the issues that you're talking about, more concerned about the ability of young people to buy housing, or for renters to be able to buy their first house, or for newcomers to be able to buy a house, that have actually been the ones that have been more opposed to some of the changes that our provincial government has been arguing for and put in place to increase supply. And I'll give you one example that really bothers me. This is the issue of development fees, where development fees are charged on new home building, condos, townhomes, single-family homes, whatever, and they are in Toronto. They went up by 47% last year, and they are hugely greater than the incremental infrastructure cost of building whatever it is to allow that new development to take place. And it just goes into general revenue. And it's been a way of keeping property taxes for everyone else lower. It's been effectively, some people have described it as a slush fund. I don't think it's quite a slush fund, but it's that kind of a thing. But when you think, and they've argued that these are progressive politicians that have argued, well, if you lower the development fees, it's just going to go into the pockets of the developers. And that's been their way of trying to argue against it. That's never been shown, that what the developers will get is they'll increase the supply and they'll reduce the prices. So people are going to end up buying more homes. But because the development fees are higher, they've been able to keep property taxes lower. And so therefore their argument is to the provincial government, if I've now got to reduce the development fees, I can't increase the property taxes and everyone else. And so I got to go again, hat in hand, to the provincial government. It doesn't make logical sense to me, because a progressive politician should not be benefiting old people that look like me at the expense of younger people, first-time home buyers, new immigrants, renters that want to become home buyers, et cetera. It's the opposite of what I would have thought a progressive system was all about. How has this come to be?
Politics responds to those who organize and show up, and an older demographic is still more likely to cast a ballot at the voting box. So all politicians, regardless of their party stripes, are playing that political game. So that does behoove a younger demographic to ramp up its political participation, to resist the cynicism that politics is entirely broken, and be more active in using the numbers that they now have to sway votes. I also think, though, that you've really summarized a lovely tension for us to talk about. We do need some development charges. We're building more units. We got to raise the development charges to cover the costs of the sewer, the water, the electricity, and so on. There's amenities that need to go for the new houses, and so it makes sense to some degree to have the development process contribute to those costs. But you're right. I have long encouraged developers to actually join forces with a group like Gen Squeeze to say, start championing with us this idea of progressivity in property taxation, so that we spread the raising of revenue from housing over a much broader number of units rather than just the new units you're building. That would allow you then to be bringing in these new units at a price point that's more competitive, more in reach for those who are going to be initially buying them, and would actually acknowledge that as we're changing zoning to allow more density in areas which currently have been reserved, say, for that single detached home, the owner of that single detached unit may I don't want that many more neighbors. The moment they're allowed to put more units on that property, their property goes up even still further. They just got wealth printed for them because of the zoning change, and they get to accumulate it all without sharing any of that back to the broader public who printed the wealth by changing the zoning. So I think, actually, Brian, your conversation with me today, I wish I'd turned it around, that I was interviewing you, and I was like, Brian, how do we get more in your demographic, articulating what you just said to me? that we don't need politics catering as much as it is to your demographic that's securely housed at the expense of leaving the legacy that you and others want to for your kids and grandchildren and newcomers who might join our country. That's what we need to get happening. We need an older demographic to join forces with something like Gen Squeeze to create the political cover for our politicians to say, we're going to make Toronto work for all generations. And right now it's not working for younger.
It's certainly not working for younger. It's not working for renters that want to buy, and it's not working for newcomers. And I think it's a travesty, and I think it is a testament. It's proof that politicians are regrettably not doing what's right, but what are doing what's politically expedient to get them voted in again. And I think that's wrong. Let me ask you another question, if I could. Pew Research in the United States showed a study that showed that today, far less people believe that their kids will be better off in the future than existed 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's actually almost the inverse. It was like 75% of people thought that their kids would be better off. And today it's like 25% of society thinks their kids are going to be better off. 75% think their kids are going to be worse off. And so we older generation people actually think, and this is US, but I got to believe it's similar in Canada, that things are worse for our kids. Isn't that the way to appeal to us? Is that we've got to do something better for them?
I think you're absolutely right. The data you described about the US absolutely pertain to the Canadian reality. I mean, let me just summarize it. A younger demographic goes to post-secondary for years more, taking on more student debt for the privilege, to land jobs that, once you adjust for inflation, would pay thousands of dollars less, to then face housing prices that are up hundreds of thousands, which then locks them out of ownership and into renting for much longer periods of their lives. Their consolation prize is rising rents. That's all happening as their biological clocks are tick-tocking. People are delaying starting their families, but they can only delay so long, and then they go and they have their families in childcare until we got $10 a day childcare, something that Gen Squeeze has been championing for a long time. That would be another rent size payment. Parental leave would be another mortgage size payment. And that's that personal financial vice grip that people find themselves in. And then that vice grip is tightened still further publicly because younger people inherit larger government debts and larger environmental debts. That's the legacy being inherited by today's young people in Canada. And so I don't think that's the story that today's aging population wants to see. This is parents and grandparents want, as you just described, for their kids to do better than they did. And I think this is where politics is letting us down. This is where kind of typical class analysis has really been disguising too much of what's happening in Canadian politics. We aren't foregrounding in our elections that things are deteriorating for a younger demographic, in part because our aging population on their watch hasn't been assertive enough to say, no, we want better for our kids and grandkids. I need the grandmothers out there, and I will, sometimes grandfathers can be a bit grumpier than grandmothers, is my experience. But for the non-grumpy grandfathers and all the grandmothers out there, we need your voices. I know retirement is a moment of fear about biological frailty, and will I be able to stretch my income throughout my years in retirement so that I'm not vulnerable financially? Those are legitimate fears to consider, and we need good public policy to address them. And I want to say that Canada is actually relatively good at doing that. It's why seniors have the lowest rates of low income of any age group in our country, and why Stats Canada shows they have the most wealth of anyone in our country. And what we need is that the secure members of that aging population to now turn their attention to legacy. And you might be angry at first hearing somebody like me at Gen Squeeze saying the legacy is not as good as you might have hoped. But don't take that as my pitting you against younger generations. It's my saying the first way to solving a problem is acknowledging it. And we can have intergenerational solidarity. We can make this country work for all generations, but we need a sympathetic demographic of older people to say, when I take a second look at the legacy we risk leaving, it's not nearly as good as I would have hoped. And I want to now lean in with the years that remain to help change that so that history will write better about it. And more importantly than that, I can do what I can for my kids and my grandchildren's demographics.
A lot of what we've been talking about is redistribution, but don't we also have to address sort of the size of the pie? And, some of the other realities is that the median real wage has not increased in the last 10, 15 years in Canada. Productivity is anemic. our former Minister of Finance wrote a book that said that we didn't have a growth agenda, we didn't have a prosperity agenda, that we lacked, increases in productivity. What's gone wrong in our economy of late, such that we aren't creating economic growth and wealth that's going to benefit younger people?
Well, housing's at the epicenter of this problem as well. If you look at our gross domestic product, what's been driving our GDP, the biggest industrial contributor to gross domestic product in Canada is real estate, rental, and leasing. It represents 14% of our economy, but fewer than 2% of people make their livelihoods in that industry. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, what it means is we've been growing our economy by growing the major cost of living higher. Those who own that major cost of living, homeowners, they're getting more wealth and equity. Real estate agents and their companies make good annual earnings. And everybody else has their hard work pay off less because they're not in industries seeing that bump in their earnings from the growth of our GDP, and their major cost of living is leaving them behind. And then we use tax policy and, as you pointed out earlier, low interest rates to kind of incentivize people to borrow more and borrow more and borrow more. And when we borrow in Canada, we put it into bidding up the price of existing housing. That doesn't give us any productivity gain. What we really desperately need is a plan for economic thriving that says, we don't want to count on real estate, especially the value of existing homes, to be driving GDP. We need to incentivize investment outside of existing homes into way more productive industries, the green jobs of the future, the manufacturing of the future. That's where we're going to get productivity gains. And with the productivity gains, we'll get better earnings, which eventually, if we commit to saying we don't want home prices to rise any longer, we could slowly but surely have earnings somewhat catch up. So, incentivize investment outside of existing homes. And people, what do you mean existing homes? I mean, yes, we need to invest to build new supply still. And we probably need to build especially a lot of purpose-built rental. But we've got to discourage so much of our borrowing and investment going into the fact that my home, it was about $1 million of my investment in it. Now it's worth 2.4. The home's older. I'm having to fix the floors right now. My stovetop isn't as good as it used to be. There's no productivity gain there. It's just a wealth windfall. Let's direct the investment into things that make us more prosperous, more productive.
How did we get here?
Well, this is a lazy way to grow GDP. You don't have to do much if you just start banking on the value of existing assets inflating. And then politicians of all party stripes can claim, I'm a good economic manager. You can see this amongst NDP, Liberals, Conservatives. We would see it, I imagine, if there would have been a Green leader as well. And so what we need to do is actually, it's so funny, I've just come back from a conference, which is large part about moving beyond gross domestic product as measuring our success. Because I just heard, I heard again in a Metro Vancouver radio station, politicians are like, oh, our economy's really strong. But our GDP is not that bad by comparison with other places. But that's because we have more housing and affordability here than anywhere. And so I would love for a politician to say, you know what, I'm going to tolerate GDP stalling if that happens because housing prices stall. I'm like, that'd be good, actually. If housing prices stall, we get more affordability. If that then actually starts us to encourage, like, I want to invest more in that manufacturing over there or those green tech jobs over there, then heck, if that doesn't grow as fast as really say, I don't really care, because that actually will grow earnings, that'll grow wages, that will grow jobs of the future. And we need an economic thriving strategy that's going to move beyond GDP, because GDP is giving us inaccurate signals. It's an important one measure, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all.
I think that you also touched on one of the main reasons why we've fallen into this, and that's because young people don't vote, and so therefore their voices aren't heard, their concerns aren't listened to and addressed adequately enough. And I really do think that you talk about in your thing, you're right up on the website about your involvement in democracy and rejuvenating democracy to protect what is sacred. And I think that whether it's proportional representation or compulsory voting, or something that allows young people to, if not frankly forces young people to get out and vote, but allows them to think that their vote actually counts. Because too often people don't vote because they just don't think that their extra vote's going to count. And our first past the post system does mess up the results fairly dramatically over and over and over again. In the last election in Ontario, a conservative vote counted 6 times an NDP vote in its power to elect MPPs.
Yeah, exactly.
And an NDP vote was 6 times what a Liberal vote was, just because of the way the splits worked. And so I think too often leaves people with a concern that democracy isn't working. And I think proportional representation would alleviate some of that, and compulsory voting, like in Australia, would dramatically benefit that.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you in terms of proportional representation. I'm deeply saddened by the fact that, in 2015, we were told it was going to be our last first past the post election, and that didn't come to fruition. I would also draw attention to your listeners to the fact that UNICEF Canada right now is part of a campaign to lower the voting age to 16. I'm a strong proponent for that, actually. I think that we know that if you get young people voting early, they'll continue to vote. And we could use schooling and our social studies course and whatnot as a way to socialize. I don't care how they vote, but to socialize their voting. And someone might say, "Oh my God, we can't use public institutions like that to start fostering voting, because what happens if teachers somehow impart their values to their students, and that's going to sway them to vote in problematic ways?" And I'm like, my grandmother, she lived until she was 103, and she lived in a care home for the last 6-7 years of her life. And what I thought was so beautiful is we would actually bring voting boxes into her care home and facilitate her voting on voting day, because it was harder for her to get to a ballot box. And I can tell you with certainty that as she experienced dementia, her voting patterns completely changed compared to what she would have voted pre-dementia. But I'm like, have at it, whatever. She's practicing, exercising her vote, and she's subject to the influence of care people around her. She is, but that's okay, because democracy needs institutions to help bolster up our voting rates. And so it should also be with our school system. Let's socialize kids to start voting when they're 16, and then I'm much more confident they'll vote when they're 20 and 24 than is the current case. So go UNICEF Canada.
Dr. Paul Kershaw of an incredible organization called Generation Squeeze. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
We're going to take a final break, and I'm going to come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone, and thank you to Dr. Paul Kershaw.